I'm Zeynep, a research fellow at the Sharq Forum. Today in Istanbul, I have with me David Hearst, the editor-in-chief of Middle East Eye. We were in Istanbul for this conference, envisioning a post-crisis regional order in the region. Welcome, Mr. Hearst. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you, and thank you for inviting me again. I found this conference absolutely fascinating. Not just as usual, the public speeches, but also the sort of the depth and knowledge of the participants.
Thank you for coming. You definitely enriched our debate. Today, now, since we have this time, we want to talk with you about the recent Russian attack on Aleppo, which you earlier qualified in our private conversation as the biggest military attack that Russian Federation has done since the Cold War. Can you talk to us about what are the Russian plans? What are the limits of the Russian military?
Well, it's the biggest Russian military operation outside the Russian Federation's borders. They've done something similar. Putin did something similar in Grozny when he first came to power, and it was as a result of his operation in Chechnya that he came to national prominence. He was, at the time, one of a series of prime ministers, and the prime ministers at that time were not very strong. All the power rested in the presidential system, and he made his name for himself in crushing Chechen separatism. And he feels he's still fighting roughly the same enemy. What happened in Chechnya, of course, was that the opposition split. One side, which was the more nationalist side, less religious, went into exile and have become dormant, and the more religious side of it formed the basis of what has now become the Islamic State or fighters in the North Caucasus, and now, of course, they're in Syria. And in Iraq as foreign fighters. So you'll find Chechens in Raqqa, for instance. What's going through Putin's head? Well, of course, you've got to remember that Putin has already tried to withdraw once. He was originally invited in by the Iranians and by the Revolutionary Guards, who said, listen, you've got to come in, otherwise Damascus will fall. And if Damascus falls, the regime falls. Only Russian firepower can save us, which was quite a concession in the first place when you consider what had been levelled at the rebels. So Russia has already come in. He then announced in a sort of Bush-like way, mission accomplished, and started withdrawing some of his
And they also did some plays, like from time to time they would withdraw the air support, and then Damascus forces would fall. And they keep on doing that, but they reasserted themselves in Aleppo. And what's the plan there?
Well, again, what's the plan? We're assuming that this was premeditated. And I think my reading of Putin is that it's much more tactical, much less strategic. It was a reaction to the collapse of the talks process with Kerry. I think that the killer moment was the American attack on Syrian opposition, Syrian regime positions in Deir ez-Zor, with the loss of more than 60 Syrian troops. That was a deal breaker for Putin, and Putin interpreted that as a deliberate attack. The Pentagon said, sorry, it was a mistake, we got the wrong people, but Putin thought it was deliberate. And from that time onwards, all bets were off, and he said, fine, right, we're going to launch this all-out assault on Aleppo. I don't think, and having done that, it is an all-out assault. He has to now take Aleppo, and then he will probably claim at some point that the war's over or the regime has won. Certainly Assad is talking in those terms. He's talking about an all-out war. And I think for Russia, this has real complications, because if the regime ever took East Aleppo again, it would take a whole bunch of ruins. I don't think any fighters are going to voluntarily abandon Aleppo. And if they do, there's every chance that Aleppo would become like Ramadi or would become like Mosul. It would be fought over continuously over the next few years. I don't believe that any of these huge cities that fall forever. And in that sense, there is a pattern that has actually been set. And that poses a real problem for Russia, because Putin needs a quick victory. He needs, I think his basic audience is America, as well as the Middle East. He wants to show America that that America cannot dictate the post-Cold War scenario, and he wants a victory for Russia. But the longer this military confrontation goes on, the more there are questions about how he's going to pay for it, and the relevance of this to Russian domestic opinion, which we must also not forget, that there isn't this huge swell of domestic opinion saying we Russian troops should be fighting in Syria. There's an awful lot of talk about Putin originally said, and his advisors originally said, if we don't fight them in Syria, we'll be fighting them on the Moscow metro. A complete simulacrum of the Bush argument and the Blair argument that homeland defence
is done abroad.
Is done abroad. He's using exactly American logic, and I would assume he's also making American type mistakes, because in exactly the same way, this isn't going to be decisive. It's going to be long drawn out. It isn't going to be a killer punch. It isn't going to be the knockout blow. At least I don't think it is. And in that sense, there are problems, and I think there are strains, for instance, between Iran and Russia. I don't think it's the same agenda at all. Originally, you see, when Putin came into Syria, he also suggested that there had been a lot of reluctance to come in on Assad's side. There'd been a long period of time when Russia hadn't stepped in, and Russia used its initial entry as a combatant in the Syrian civil war to the international community, saying, right, okay, fine, you don't like us there, but we are a lever as well. We are a lever, and we have bought ourselves a seat at the table.
Exactly, and like talking through that seat at the table and at the collapse of the American and the Russian deal. From what you have been seeing, I'm hearing that almost, you said like Putin is usually tactical, not strategic, but I've been also hearing from what you're saying, and that Putin actually might be trying that American elections are coming, and if he gets Aleppo with the next president, he has a much better, much stronger seat at the table and a much heavier hand. Can we say that the Putin is using this time where the American elections are coming, Obama is more on the withdrawal side in the Middle East politics, and he wants to capitalize on that, and then when the next president comes into the office, Putin has a much stronger hand?
Well, yes and no. He's certainly using this period as a window of opportunity. He's certainly sensed that America, and he's rightly sensed, that America will do nothing except issue an awful lot of sound bites, harsh words, but it'll be words, it'll be verbal. There'll be nothing substantive under the table. Whether or not that's entirely true, I don't know, because I would imagine that what's happened is that the American veto on the quality of arms going into Aleppo has changed or has been lifted. And they would allow other nations, I'm thinking of the Saudis, the Qataris, or even the Turks, of allowing slightly more sophisticated weaponry through. And there was talk of man pads that were allowed in, which could shoot down helicopters. That doesn't actually affect the Russian bombers because they are much higher up in the sky. You need something much more sophisticated to shoot them down. But Putin's right. He's suggested a window of opportunity. Whether that puts him in a stronger or weaker position with the next American president depends on who the next American president is. And as we're speaking at the moment, Trump's campaign has imploded, I think terminally. And so what we've got is Hillary. And what Hillary Clinton has been saying to the Syrian opposition and to the SFA is, hang on in there, stay your ground, keep fighting, wait till I come. And that's the message. That is not something that Putin wants to hear. You could say that's the reason for him wanting a quick victory, because he'll then he'll present Hillary with a fait accompli to say that yes, we're in charge of Aleppo. But I don't think he will be in charge of Aleppo.
So that's the yes and no side. Yes and no, you said.
I also think Russia will not be in a strong position. But his calculation is that he will be.
Why do you think they won't be, like with all these attacks and stuff?
Because however you divide the Syrian opposition, and Russia has tried many times and prides itself in its own contacts with Syrian opposition. The effect of the Russian attack has been to get rival groups of the opposition together. It's been a recruiter. It's been the Russian bombardment, particularly against civilians, has been a massive shot of urgency, an injection of urgency into the arm of the Syrian opposition. It is united forces that refuse to fight with each other or even fought against each other. That still remains. Whether they're in Aleppo or whether they're in Turkish-controlled northern Syria, which is going to be just a few kilometers away, this doesn't matter. They're still there, and they're still going to be wanting to mount attacks. So what Putin has done has been to coalesce forces around the SFA because they are another foreign invader and they are a bomber. Yeah.
And I think it just as you said, from what you said, I'm hearing that like the Russia being in the side of regime, and that's just like much more of a consolidation effect on the opposition, and which shows that the whole thing in Syria is not necessarily ISIS, not extremism, but the presence of Assad is the root cause in the Syrian conflict.
Yeah, the other thing that's happened is that all the other things that have happened in the US-Russian relationship, which has really descended to quite a lot of depths. In terms of they've just torn up. They've been basically tearing up all the agreements, or most of the agreements that they came to after the end of the Soviet Union. And the last one that they tore up was an agreement to get rid of plutonium. Each side wanted to get rid of excess plutonium, so that it wouldn't then be used for warheads, and it was basically a disarmament. They've now torn that up. Furthermore, they're saying that the restoration of any form of bilateral relations between Moscow and Washington is dependent on the end of sanctions, the end of the Magnitsky Act, and so they're using this as levers for all sorts of other regimes. And of course, the West, forget the West or America, let's just say the Dutch government, many of whose citizens died in a plane overflying the Ukrainian conflict and was actually shot down. The opinion is hardening all over the place. And they want to then take, or it may be Malaysia, they want to take Russia to the International Criminal Court. The relatives of the dead want a legal process. They want some form of accountability. So the actual divisions between all the fault lines are widening at the moment. And I think at the moment it's one-way traffic, and the traffic is back to possibly the worst relationship since even between Moscow and Washington since long before perestroika. I would say that Russian and American relations have never been this bad, and the problem with the Middle East is that it's the arena where other problems are being sorted out. The Middle East has got enough problems of its own, and it is complicated, but it is actually, when you were talking about Russia's involvement in Syria, at least part of Putin's motivations has got nothing to do with Syria. It's got to do with all the injustices that Russia felt it had been subject to: the eastern expansion of NATO, Crimea, Western arrogance that it could take, the loss of Eastern Europe. It's got a lot of other issues, and sanctions against Russian individuals, sanctions against Putin himself, and it just becomes much, much more complex.
So, David, all these things we have talked between Russia and America, and what does it mean for the other countries' involvement in Syria? Saudi involvement, the recent Turkish Jarablus operation, how do they get affected from this conflict between Russia and the US?
Well, on one hand, you could say they have now more freedom to act on their own. On the other hand, you could be more pessimistic and say that because they've got more freedom to act on their own, they're making exactly the same mistakes, and that intervention has now become some sort of franchise, which gets used by smaller and smaller powers, and even sub-state actors as well. So it's a mess. And one of the features of the mess is that people aren't listening to each other, and people aren't picking up each other's signals. So the world is full of surprises. Again, you know, the Saudi campaign in Yemen was launched at a time when Iran, in particular, didn't expect Saudi Arabia to act in that way. The very least you could expect in some form of international system, whether it's right or wrong, I'm not saying it, but it's a system, is that there is this sort of level of communication and that you interpret each other's signals. People are constantly misinterpreting everyone else's signals. So the Saudi bombing campaign in Yemen was a surprise to Iran, because it represented a much more active, even though it has happened many times before, this was a surprise to Iran. The Turkish intervention in Syria was as a result of the coup attempt as well. It liberated Erdogan in a sense to first he chucked out the generals who were against that sort of intervention, but it also gave Erdogan more freedom to act. I.e. the American veto on such an intervention had been lifted. So we're in a world where America has retreated psychologically. It'll probably come back again in Syria under Hillary, but that we're in a far more unstable, far more dynamic regional environment where basically things go under their own steam. The fires are burning out of control and there's no real fire brigade to actually put them out. I would like to use another analogy and simply say that what we've got to do in the region is to find ways of tackling conflicts which don't recreate the conflicts themselves. I mean, I think we need to completely lower our ambition. And what I mean by this is we've got to find a way of, for instance, if we want to tackle IS, we also have to find a way of reconstituting a proper Sunni leadership in the areas where IS operated. We don't want a situation where in chucking out the IS, all we're doing is storing up the fuel for, you know, IS Mark III. If you consider where they came from and how small a group they were when originally Zarqawi was in Herat, he had, I think, only about 80 followers and their families with him. It's a really, really small group. It's a subgroup of Al-Qaeda. That then displaces Al-Qaeda and becomes the major fighting force, mimicking all the attributes, tax collection, bread production of a state. Yeah. We've got to stop that process. We've actually got to stop the process of, in fighting one set of jihadis, we create another set. That is just a sort of a very modest aim. But if we started with modest aims, rather than talking about the nature of the Arab state or the failure of the modern state or failed states, we've got to start from where we are. And where we are is to stop the chaos spreading. So that's what we've got to do.
Thank you, David, for all this amazing, insightful conversation.
Okay,
and hope
thanks a
to
lot.
see you back with Sharq.
Sure, I will be back. Thank you. Thanks.